Good afternoon, Professor Farid Esack. It's an honor to have your presence here. Today we will discuss Israel's recent move to acquire observer status at the African Union and the consequences of it. My name is Caio Porto. I'm a PhD student at the University of Brasilia, and I also am a member of Juventude Sanaúd, or a youth organization focused on the Palestinian struggle in Brazil. Uh, we have also here Professor Muhammad Odeh from the University of Brasilia too, and Professor Fábio Bacila Sad from the Federal University of Maranhão. Now I will introduce you to our audience Professor Farid. Uh, Farid Esack, born 1955 in Windhoek, Cape Town. He is a South African Muslim scholar, writer, and political activist known for his opposition to apartheid. His appointment by Nelson Mandela as a gender equity commissioner, and his work for inter-religious dialogue. The premise of this talk is as follows. During the year 2021, a period in which the escalation of military and violence against the Palestinian civilian population in the occupied territories was accompanied by two international reports, B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, characterizing Israel as a state of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. HRW and B'Tselem's description of Israel as an apartheid state had great worldwide repercussions, followed by waves of denunciation and protests. In this context, Israel finds itself in a situation in which it needs to refute the negative effects on their public image as they are exposed as racist and as an apartheid state. The Israeli government has been acting in order to have its existence as a settler colonial ethno-state legitimized, seen in a different light globally, and in this case, more precisely in Africa, through its affiliation to the African Union. We will discuss Israel's entry into the African Union and the consequences of this for its legitimacy vis-à-vis the geopolitical international system and also its expansion in Africa. This continent that has always been the stronghold of decoloniality and anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist struggle was because of it generally favorable to the Palestinian struggle. However, the unity inside the African Union is now being fractured as several countries rejected the affiliation of a colonial enterprise as Israel into the AU, which has its political roots in the anti-colonial struggle. What are the Israeli government's intentions in becoming part of the African Union at a time when HRW and B'Tselem, among others, have already defined it as an apartheid state? Which type of political act will it be? And finally, what is to be done? We want to know about the mobilization of Africa for Palestine, which you, Farid, is part of, concerning this matter. There have been many protests, but we also want to know how they will move on, address this issue in light of the statute of the African Union itself, which is clearly adamant against racism and apartheid practices. Uh, this subject also encompasses the Arab member countries of the AU and, by association, extends to members of the Arab League and splits its positions as well. A super complex subject, but which we must try to understand. What exactly is this real politic in circulation and what is contesting it? At the center of everything is the legitimization of Israel in a different international forum. This is not the first time that Israel has applied for an observer member of the AU. It did so in previous years and was rejected. This time, Morocco as a state has normalized relations and Israel on it. But Morocco himself has been out of the AU since its founding until 2017, and it was due to the issue of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic being part of the foundation and being a member of the AU. So, Professor Farid, feel free to share your thoughts on these complex topics. Professor Muna and Professor Fabio, please feel free to contribute, collaborate, and ask our guests about the issues we intend to debate here. Thank you so much, colleagues and comrades. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caio, and I'm delighted to be with the Youth Sanaúd. Yeah, it's, I think, the second time that I'm sharing a platform with both Professor Muna and Professor Saad, and it's an absolute delight for me to be with you guys again. Now, I think that we are facing a particular crisis, and I don't want us to make light of this. And in some ways, there is nothing new about what Israel is busy with. It is in many ways an extension of the old colonial wars for the bodies, the life, the wealth, and the resources of people in the global south. So this fight for Africa, there's nothing new about it. We've seen this fight in Latin America. We've seen this fight in Asia. We've seen this fight in various parts as colonialism early on in it, and now, I mean, in the form of neo-colonialism and its various economic and political dimensions. So that's the first thing that I want to say. The second thing is that, you know, while it is useful for us to sometimes think of other formations as our natural partners, we shouldn't always assume that because we have shared a common oppression or a common history of colonialism, therefore we will always be on the same page as each other. I mean, it's like fairly common that many African countries that were colonized, they did not translate their own experiences. I'm talking about, say, the leaders of quote-unquote decolonized Africa or post-colonial Africa. Many of these leaders, they didn't translate their struggle against colonial oppression in terms of, say, for example, gender oppression. So it is possible for you to be deeply committed to the national liberation of your country and at the same time to adopt very reactionary and oppressive policies on the question of women in your country, or on the question of, say, sexual minorities in the newly liberated country, or the question of people who are ethnically different from the mainstream ethnic majority. So, and so, yes, I mean, Africa has had a common history of colonialism with Palestine, but its history of support for the Palestinian cause has not always been kind of, you know, just a question of open support. Right from the beginning, in fact, of the founding of Israel and the first Nakba, Israel had already really made serious moves into Africa. In fact, one of the great fathers of our continent's liberation Kwame Nkrumah, he had a very soft spot for Israel right in the beginning, and it was only 8 years after the liberation of Ghana that he turned against Africa. But yeah, however, for a long time in the beginning, it was until the early 70s, in fact, that Israel had quite a strong position on the continent. When the 73 Israeli-Arab War started, Israel, in fact, at that time had the full diplomatic ties with 33 countries. But of course, it was afterwards, the October War, that changed all of this. Largely under Egyptian leadership, the African Organization of African Unity at that time came out very strongly against Israel, and there were in fact only 2 or 3 countries then that continued maintaining a diplomatic relation with Israel. And amongst those countries, interestingly, it was apartheid South Africa. It was apartheid South Africa and only 2, 3 small countries in our neighborhood that South Africa had control over that continued diplomatic ties with South Africa, with Israel. The one was Lesotho, the other one was Swaziland. Lesotho is completely surrounded by South Africa. Swaziland is a small state, a neighboring state, completely dependent on South Africa. And then there was the dictatorship of Malawi, with whom, and Malawi was one of the few South African countries that also recognized apartheid South Africa. So then, what we see happening in the late 70s onwards, Israel was regarded by nearly the whole continent, except for the apartheid supported the apartheid regime and its 2, 3 allies that it had control over. Regrettably, so what then happened to that anti-Israel position, pro-international solidarity, identifying Israel as part or as an apartheid state? What happened to that uniformity or complete agreement in Africa? The problem is that so earlier on we were clear. In 1975, in fact, the African heads of state adopted a resolution that declared that the racist regime in occupied Palestine and the racist regimes in Zimbabwe and South Africa, they've got a common imperialist origin. They form a whole and they have the same racist structure, being organically linked in their policy, aimed at the repression of the dignity and integrity of the human being. And that Organization of Africa Unity Heads of States meeting in 1975 declared that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The problem really started with the Oslo Agreement. And so the Oslo Agreement was, of course, a huge setback for Palestinians, and also for the solidarity that they existed with the Palestinians. And it was then in the 1990s that we saw support for Palestine becoming less and less in Africa. And this was largely as a consequence of the USA-sponsored peace process. So, and so on the one hand, yes, it has been Israel's success, but it's not just a question of Israel's success. It's also been a question of how the Arab politics shifted in the middle of 1970s. The Arab states clearly didn't speak with a singular voice. They had no unified strategy anymore, neither regarding Africa nor anywhere else. In fact, before that, people often spoke about an Afro-Middle Eastern bloc, but no. And then, of course, we know how that has culminated in more recently in the extension of Israeli diplomatic ties with the Emirates, Bahrain, and of course, it's not announced, but for all intents and purposes, also with the Saudis and other Gulf states. And here you find a huge difference between the South African situation and the Palestinian situation. In the South African case, our country, South Africa, apartheid South Africa, was surrounded by what we call the frontline states. Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Namibia, right up to not even a neighboring country, but further north, Tanzania, where they actively gave support, including support for the armed struggle, to the people of South Africa. Of course, in the case of Palestine, there's hardly a notion of frontline states. It is, on the whole, surrounded, and by frontline, we normally use it in the military sense, where these countries are in the same struggle or in the same trenches as you. But we see that in the case of Palestine, the country is, in fact, with possibly the exception of the south of Lebanon, the country is really surrounded by reactionary regimes that are openly and covertly working against the Palestinians. So there is still a strong memory in Africa and a strong sense of solidarity, and now we must distinguish between the people of Africa and often the governments of Africa, that solidarity with Palestine remains strong because there is the shared past and present experience between the Palestinians who've been oppressed for so long, and of course, like the African people. And so for many of us, the people of Africa, Israel does represent a cruel colonizer with a hunger, I mean, that can't be stilled for Palestinian land and Palestinian homes, okay? And it's a hunger that is inbuilt into Zionism. And again, I mean, okay, I'll come back to the question of the more recent moves on Israel. You know, often people compare the Israeli situation with the South African apartheid situation. That is a legitimate comparison in many respects. But in some respects, it's not a workable comparison. For example, the white people in South Africa, they had a desperate need for resources and for cheap labor. The developing economy, capitalism, this is what it needed. But apartheid South Africa never desired the death of all Black South Africans, or the expulsion of Black South Africans, or the disappearance of Black South Africa. Israel, on the contrary, by its very basis, demands the disappearance of the Palestinians. They may be talking about the two-state solution, which is complete bull, because Zionism, by its very nature, means the ingathering of people all over the world who ethnically identify or are identifiable as Jews must come back. And given the smallness of the territory, there is no ways that they can all come back throughout the world and not displace the Palestinians. So inherent in the basic idea of Zionism is actually the other side of it is a death wish for the Palestinians as a people. But of course, and that's a huge difference. But in the same way that the European exploitation of Africa had never really come to an end, but we now see how European this thing continues, okay? Except that it's also now a more global thing or a more global north thing. So, you know, the political interference in the economy, military interventions in our country, you've seen this in Libya, we've seen it in Mali, we're now seeing this again in Eritrea and Ethiopia. This is, you know, Africa is still a hostage to Western priorities. And it's important to remember that, okay? So now to come to the context for this recent Israel incursion or attempts to get really into Africa. We see that a number of countries in Africa, it's also the market, you know, for Israeli counterterrorism technologies and so on. Israel continues to push the same colonial ideas that enslaved and subjugated the continent for centuries. Yeah, so more specifically, and I'll try to be brief on this, is on the recent events that started in July of 2022, the 22nd of July this year, when the chairperson of the African Union Commission, on his own, without any consultations, he accepted the credentials of Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia. And immediately after that, the Israeli government announced that Israel had been granted observer status. You know, it's like we've planted the flag and it has been established and so on. And it was only a day or two later when the African Union Commission's office confirmed that they were in fact accredited. Now, of course, I mean, the whole continent was shaken by this. Many of the countries objected to it, to which the chairperson of the commission said that, look, it was within his power to accredit a country that doesn't really exist inside Africa. That was his first argument. The second argument that he made was the rules did not force him to consult with other member states. Now, first, it's very important to bear in mind that that Israel wasn't given observer status. Observer status in the African Union is only given to NGOs and to public organizations. It's not given to states, okay? So there's a difference between accreditation and observer status. So countries that are not based in Africa, that are not African, they may apply for accreditation, not observer status. So Israel claimed that it had been given observer status, as I said, something which can only be given to NGOs. And there is actually a difference between observer status that NGOs get and the accreditation of countries from abroad. NGOs, on the one hand, are allowed to attend closed meetings on any discussion that their organization is interested in. But accredited states that don't belong to the continent, they're not allowed into such meetings. Now, the embassies of other countries that exist in Addis Ababa that hosts the center of the African Union, they may attend open sessions, okay, if they are accredited, and they can participate in meetings. They have access to documents that are not confidential. Okay. Observer status, observers, though, on the other hand, have a responsibility. They must submit reports to the AU every 3 years, and they should talk about their financial stability, how does this support the AU, and so on. So now to come back, and I'll try to be as brief as possible about this. It wasn't simply a question of did the chairperson have the right to or not, because the AU's charter says that any request to be accredited, and I'm quoting now, must be on the basis of the principles and objectives and the relevant decisions of the AU organs. So, and it also makes it clear when the views of a particular state, when the views of the AU are opposed to that of a particular state, the AU is required to not accept the request for accreditation. Now, there are a few countries in Africa that supported Israel. The most distinct amongst them is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and then painfully, sadly, also Morocco. And the case of Morocco is, of course, very interesting. Morocco has been chased out of the African Union for a long time because of its occupation of the Sahrawi, the Sahrawi Democratic Republic's territory. And it was when Morocco was allowed back into the AU in the beginning of Trump's administration, that Morocco started using its muscle as a kind of a Trojan horse, you know, to push Israel's interest on the continent. I mean, and we've seen how, how the Moroccan monarchy has been going these things, also kind of opening diplomatic relations with Israel. So there have been a number of occasions in the past where the AU had rejected Israeli attempts in 2013 and 2016. There's been lots of condemnation on the continent to Israel's things. I mean, at the last count, there was at least 25 countries that objected to Israel getting observer or accredited status on the continent. And there's been a significant uproar. And we're grateful that that has been led by South Africa, which has been supported strongly by the neighboring countries as well as Algeria. Now, in October, we expected some kind of decision when the Executive Council met. And unfortunately, they did not decide on the matter, and they decided to shift it to a summit of the heads of state this coming January. There, we hope that finally the question of Israel will be decided. So, yeah, that's the broad context of Africa and Palestine, and then more specifically, the later question on Israel's attempt to get observer status or accreditation with the African Union. Now, in many ways, of course, it is an African issue in the same way that the liberation of Palestine is a Palestinian issue. But in many other ways, it is far more of an international issue than what it is an African issue. And as the point that I made earlier on, it is a question of the ongoing squeezing of the continent by the global north or the erstwhile imperial powers. Now, the question is, of course, I mean, what do we do? How do we respond to all of this? Look, let me be upfront and say that the last 4-5 years have really not been easy for people in the global south. And the last few decades, particularly of advanced capitalism, has not been easy for the earth. Okay, it has not been easy for the earth. Trump's coming to power, much as many of us felt, okay, it's a good thing that he came to power, because then we can see imperialism in its true shape. As you know, you recognize the devil for what the devil is. So there were some of us in the left who actually welcomed it. We were tired of being hoodwinked, you know. I mean, 8 years of Obama, and then, you know, as if there was such a great choice for the world between Obama and Clinton, and, you know, and it is a woman who will now command, you know, the use of drones against innocent civilians rather than a man. But it is the same white, macho, aggressive underpinnings that have always characterized colonialism's responses to the people in the global south. But we must admit, for example, the shift of the capital of the embassy, the US embassy, to Jerusalem, and the squeezing of Africa. I mean, even, I mean, the coup that took place in the Sudan, you know, all these countries were pressurized to the US's pressure on Morocco that it will ignore the Moroccan occupation of the Sahrawi Republic if Morocco restarts its diplomatic relations with Israel on the one hand, and if Morocco uses its money to fund other African states, and the US, of course, tying economic aid and so on, or quote unquote aid, to diplomatic relations with Israel. So there has been huge setbacks for us, okay? So now, let's be upfront about this also, that the Palestinian Authority, that is the leading diplomatic kind of force for the Palestinians, they have become quite moribund, quite kind of half dead and limping in their relations with African state and in their diplomacy and so on, with a notable exception of the work being done by the ambassador in South Africa. And so they've also neglected Africa. So this, on the one hand, the fact that Africa, in large part, it is still dominated by corrupt either oligarchies or complete fascists. All of that are huge challenges for us. Now, later, I think in December sometimes, there is an international, or no, there is an African, a whole Africa conference in South Africa, at least of all the Palestinian ambassadors in Africa. But given the nature of diplomacy and the weakness of Abbas and the PA, the usefulness of that is still to be seen. We've done a good bit of work. Unfortunately, not with the politicians that are in power in a number of different countries, from Kenya to Zimbabwe to Zambia to Mozambique, Namibia, and Angola. we're working, I mean, like the Palestinian solidarity movement in other parts of the world. And the one difference is that in South Africa, we work very closely with the government. And yesterday, in fact, there was a video that went viral of a South African diplomat, I think in the West Bank, or I don't know exactly, but really having a terrible argument with an Israeli soldier who was preventing a woman from picking up olives and putting it into a basket. So South African diplomacy has been kind of okay. I'm saying okay because in terms of where other countries are at, I don't know, but South Africa may seem to be the leading country, the leading state, where Palestinian solidarity is really alive. So this on the one hand, but on the other hand, given South Africa's own history, we ought to have done much more. We ought to be offering much more solidarity. I mean, okay, we have an embassy in Israel. But what the hell is, okay, so we don't have an ambassador in Israel. We still have an embassy. But what are we doing with an embassy in Israel? A country that demanded from the rest of the world that they must cut off ties with that we're still sitting. Mercifully, I mean, the one thing that's wonderful about South Africa, there isn't a single mainstream politician that is supportive of Israel. There is one small party, and they won 1% of the local government elections that we had 2 days ago. They won only 1%. It's a Christian fundamentalist party. So the solidarity in South Africa is, relatively speaking, quite strong. There's a growing solidarity movement emerging in other parts of the continent. But regrettably, it's not nearly having the momentum that it should be having. And finally, unlike in the United States, you know, where you could have just a few Congress persons clearly on the side of the Palestinians for it to mean a significant shift in how the politicians are regarding it. In Africa, you require a far more stronger base at the ground level, a far more significant shift in the ground level before governments are going to notice you. So for now, we're putting a lot of dependence and work on strengthening our South African lobbying system and lobbying other countries through our government, this on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also need to be careful that we don't get seen as the new imperialist kids on the block in relation to other African countries. South Africa is very keen to export its progressive politics to the rest of the continent. But one has to do so cautiously. One has to do so cautiously. Finally, I want to say one huge problem that we sit with is the rise of Christian right-wing fundamentalism that is funded and supported by the United States, especially in the south of the United States, and I'm sure as it is in Latin America. And their determination to religionize the Palestinian cause or to religionize Zionism through their own kind of very biblical and literal interpretations of the end of times texts in the Hebrew Bible. Thank you very much. Muna and Fabio, you may want to come in. I'm sorry that I spoke so much.
Thank you so much, Farid. Professora Muna, será que quer começar?
Posso, Fábio? Well, to start with, I thoroughly enjoyed and learned so much from your talk, and I'm so happy that we have you again to walk us through both historically and in the current times, drawing for us the scenario, but bringing on to the surface, and this is extremely important, the contradictory factors that exist, that are at play, and rightly so. Extremely important also to understand the unpacking that you did of Africa, and this is extremely important, especially here in Brazil, a place where from the start as children, people are taught or learn, or in the social imaginary, Africa is one block, an unidentified sort of one block kind of thing, in a way as to say, this is from Africa, this is African, and I always respond, but there are 53 countries in Africa, which one are you talking about? So it's extremely important, even for people who have the consciousness of this reality, for us to walk us through the contradictions that are inherent of decolonization processes and so on, and the power structures that exist and how that influences the decision. I'm extremely happy also with your talk, despite the criticisms that you point out and that you make vis-a-vis South Africa, but I'm very happy that I carry still with me from my times in the UK when we used to protest in front of the South African embassy in the late 80s and 90s. And I'm so happy that 30 years on and further, South Africa is still a beacon. And I'm not saying this just in a romanticized form of saying it, but I actually visited South Africa in 2014, and I was impressed by young people who were not under their 20s and who were solid and very firm in their understanding from a leftist point of view of this support for Palestine beyond the borders of Palestine, of what Israel means and what it is in the constitution of capitalism and imperialism nowadays. So I'm very happy to be learning so much from you. I wanted that, if possible, if you could elaborate a little bit on this very last point, the rise of Christian right-wing fundamentalist groups, because I think we share a lot vis-a-vis this. I think in our case, it's come earlier and it's really deep-rooted. We know this from the current government. Any kind of protest of Bolsonaro nowadays is always espoused with Israeli flags, and we know the connotations of that. And the second point that I would like that you walk us through or tell us more, I mean, the question of accreditation and the way that you explained the difference between that and the observer status is extremely important. And it's very telling also that, as you told us, Israel right away announced, on the date, the 22nd of July, 2021, whereas the African Union sort of took another couple of days to come out with this news, and how that is fundamentally related to this aggressive spirit on the part of Israel to ascertain and also to sort of create fait accompli, like you were saying, in regards to this. Now, the scenario, as you were telling us, and specifically in terms of normalization, apart from Egypt, which is an African country, of course, which normalized many, many years ago, but we know that this is a process that's also has a lot of dispute and contestation on the street vis-a-vis the population, that still are not supportive of this normalization. But we have Sudan, we have the Sudan that normalized, and we have Morocco, as you were telling us. So there's a growing block, let's say, or in these two, the Abrahamic Accords that were carried out, and it's telling, to have used this this term. In all cases, Africa further and further deepening into this. And I think specifically the Sudan, it was something that was done in a very, I don't know the term, but in a slippery, accidental, I was personally deeply saddened by that. I understand also the position in regards to Morocco, but the Sudan, for me, was extremely tragic. This kind of sudden, very quick, and it has not changed. The regime in or the government in the United States has changed, but what Trump came with and imposed or brought on is still there, and it's still maintained. So these are just the 2 points that I would like that you tell us a little bit more about.
Let me take the last one on Muna before the second one, before the first one. And in many ways, you know, what Trump did right until his last days, you will remember, when he sent Jared Kushner and the US ambassador to still do a final round of the Gulf countries and wrapping them up in deals and so on. Now, of course, many of the things that he was doing was precisely to trap Biden, because if Biden were now to walk back on any of those things, Biden would clearly be seen as anti-Israel. And meanwhile, it is just trying to reverse some of the things that Trump did in his last few days. But that is unfortunately, I mean, how politics goes. The other thing that you spoke about was this Christian fundamentalism thing and its own kind of distinctions with the Abrahamic Accords and so on. Now, firstly, I mean, I think that we must be clear that that all forms of religious fundamentalisms are deeply problematic. They are often misogynistic. They are anti-poor. They are pro-capitalism. They are just deeply anti-human, okay? And the exploitation of people by other people in the name of religion. So I think that this is deeply problematic, whether it manifests itself in Judaism, or whether it manifests itself in Christianity, or whether it manifests itself in Hinduism, in India, that we see on a very problematic scale at the moment, or whether it manifests itself amongst Muslims. And this includes amongst Muslims inside Palestine, or wherever they may be. And I think it's important to acknowledge this. However, I still distinguish in the recourse that people under oppression seek in religion. I mean, as was the case in South Africa, the religious commitment of the Desmond Tutus and the Ellen Bussaks and the Beyers Nodis and their commitment to the liberation of the country and seeing Christ as a redeeming figure that stands on the side of the oppressed. That was not the same religious fervor that is utilized and instrumentalized by the religious right wing, where you have the leaders of these churches becoming wealthier and wealthier in these huge, huge churches and taking the blood from the poorer and poorer congregations in the desperate hope that we also going to get as rich as the pastor, or if we're not going to get as rich as the pastor, we will at least be rich in the next life to come. But meanwhile, the pastor is getting, or the bishop is getting all of his, usually his, but occasionally also her, wealth on this. And it is this that is being used to bring, I mean, you can see, I mean, no sensible person could, or no seriously religious person could think of Trump as a religious person. But at the same time, there was a chemistry between Trump and the right wing. The same kind of chemistry that you find between Bolsonaro and the right wing in Brazil. absolutely the same chemistry. If you talk to these as religious people, and then you ask them about any kind of religiosity in Bolsonaro's life, they would be hard-pressed and they'll probably duck and avoid the issues that you're talking about. So it's enough for Trump to stand in front of a church with the Bible, as he did once, and immediately for people to think, or for the Moroccan king to go and bow down and be seen in a mosque and so on. And that's like, okay, But what is really happening is a very selective interpretation of scripture. And the fascinating thing about Israel and Christian Zionism is, and it's like weird but understandable, how Israel is embracing a Christian fundamentalism, because Christian fundamentalism believes that the coming of Christ will only happen once Israel is occupied by the Jews. So you gather the Jews all in one place where they will all be annihilated together in the last days. So Christian fundamentalism doesn't really like the Jews. They don't really, because in their eschatology, their sense of the end of times, the Jews will be destroyed. And of course, you need to be a really dumb Zionist to not know this. Anybody that looks at the base. So the Zionists know it. But they also go from the premise that these Christian fundamentalists are idiots, but useful idiots. Useful idiots because many of them have large communities behind them. They have access to money and so on, and they can build our legitimacy, firstly inside the United States, but also now in Latin America and in Africa. And so what we're seeing, it's not just a contestation for the political soul of Africa, but also a contestation for the religious soul of Africa. And it's not any different really from how we see, Islam operating in the Gulf countries, where the basic thing is sama wa ta'a. It is to listen and to obey. This is the heart of the kind of Islam that the Gulf states are propounding. So, and of course, I think we know what this means for people who are suffering and for people who are resisting oppression. It just serves to lengthen our oppression, this on the one hand. And on the other hand, for those of us who are committed to liberation, it just serves to strengthen our resolve to bring down the demons of fundamentalism, of capitalism, and of imperialism. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Farid, for this response. Just a quick note to say that in Mozambique and Angola, some of the biggest churches that are Christian fundamentalists are Brazilian, the Assembleia de Deus. And it's exactly that scenario that you were describing, multimillionaires and with the wealth and all of that. But just to say that it does not necessarily have to be only originating from the States. It does also come from peripheral, from the periphery, if you like.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. One of the interesting things about South Africa is that the numbers of people committed to that kind of religiosity, it never translates into the way they vote politically. The Christian Fundamentalist Party, as I said, they got only 1% of the vote in the elections that were 2 days ago. It has never translated into voting in South Africa. Anyway.
Professor Fábio?
I have nothing special to say because I think Farid overview is perfect with Muna points to the correct points to aggregate to the reflection. So I very It's a very pleasure to be here with you. I'm just reading, and because all I have to say, Muna anticipate a lot of things, and your point of view is perfect. Your overview for it. So today I will be more quiet.
Thank you very much, Fabio. But I hope I haven't silenced you.
No. It's very good to hear you again, Farid. No, it's incredible.
I have a question. Can I?
Yes.
Just a minute. I wrote it down. These issues that we discussed here brought Edward Said to my thoughts, in a sense, in his book Orientalism. Said tells us about the imagined geographies that the Orientalist perspective produces. Israel is an example of a country which has a hard time imagining itself. For example, their soccer team was affiliated to the Asian, the African, and now is affiliated to the European Federation of Football. As Said puts in his book on Palestine, the Zionist project aimed at the role of a sort of a middleman between East and West in order to legitimize itself as a fortress of the West in the Middle East, white but not quite, as families famously said, white but not quite. At the same time, they try to present themselves as Europeans in a sense of being westernized, civilized, and as native, as someone who's not an occupying force, but someone who's rightfully there, always has been, etc. How do you see it? Is it a sign of the weakening of their positions as middlemen to the West and in the East, or a reconception, a rebranding of sorts, of which should be their role in the international geopolitical order?
Well, part of why they're desperate to ramp up the support for them in Africa, it is part of a rebranding thing. As Europe, for example, is getting increasingly annoyed with Israel, just annoyed with Israel, politically it makes sense, okay, we have all of these black people with us. But you also see this in the instrumentalization of the Ethiopian Jews. So we've got black people in our army. The Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia, in fact, a black African. So it's part of the rebranding that we're not really colonists in the old sense of the word. We are, quote unquote, just a returning of all the original inhabitants of the land. This on the one hand. But it's also part, I think, of the ability of the powerful to mutate and to change, how animals, for example, can mutate and change their skins and so on. So they change their skins, but the underlying logic of hierarchies and power and disdain for the other. And in this case, it is the Palestinians who are otherized. Occasionally, it can be particularly these Muslim Arabs. But this thing is equally there for the Christian Arabs or for atheist Palestinians. So occasionally it may get a religious things, but anybody who knows how Israelis respond, to say the religious rights of Christians. But then inside, it's the same, the contempt that they have for the Arab Jews, for example, or that they have for the Ethiopian Jews, the racism that there is towards black people in Jewish society. And so power has an interesting way of assuming different identities. It's like, Coca-Cola having a black CEO, or the United States having a black president. And then all of a sudden, and okay, I don't want to go on and on about Obama, but somebody who used far more drones, than any other person before him or after him in killing people in the Arab world. So I think, yes, it is a question of power, but it's also the ability of power. And that is why all of us really, as human beings, we have to be very conscious, Sometimes power comes with your maleness. Power comes with your heterosexuality. Power comes with your light skin. So if you are a woman, in relation to other men, you may be marginalized. But if you are a light-skinned woman in relation to darker-skinned women, you are, and so it's a struggle for all of us to be conscious. Of course, what we see here is the systematization of a particular kind of racism on the one hand, and on the supported by largely the US and also by Europe, and the success with which they've had in drawing other Arabs now, especially the Gulf states and Saudi and Egypt, into their project. But I do believe that it's not sustainable in the long run. I mean, well, first of all, from just an environmental point of view, nothing that is going on in the Gulf is humanly sustainable. But also, I mean, the vast population of people in the Arab world, Christian or Muslim, regardless of their religion, they continue to regard Israel as a foreign imposition. And from day one, they have regarded Israel, not the Jews. They've regarded the political state of Israel as a foreign imposition. And it remains like this until today. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, Caio.
Any more questions?
Just a point to add to what Farid has just finished telling us. Effectively, I mean, the support that Israel gave, military and otherwise, to apartheid South Africa, to Angola, and all the counter-revolutionary movement in Africa, as well as in South America, we know, and Central America. But I think that sort of remains in the memory, in the case of Africa, of many. And I think this is something that is one component only. And I believe that exactly in your talk, you updated us on the scenario in a way as to move beyond not just the heritage, if you like, or the legacy of that history of anti-colonialism and the struggle against imperialism and its forces of capitalism, but also to remind us of the new elements that exist, whereas I think the foundations remain the same. This is what I'm sensing from what you're telling us. Is it the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a fantastic way to start our discussion and to take it further on, right, Caio? I'm speaking here in regards to Sanaúd. I think this is a start, Fabio, also for us to delve further into Africa as a scenario in the same way that we look into Latin America, but we can bring on this component. And I think it was timely, this move of Israel towards accreditation or observer status. We still do not know. But the fact that this was met by resistance, and wide and broad resistance, important resistance, it took some time to pick up, but I think in South Africa, namely, that was something that caught our attention. So many thanks again, Farid.
Thank you very much, folks, for having me over. I appreciate it very much. I'm glad that to be able to be in a position to contribute. This is just a part of our life struggles, we're always at it. Freedom or death, victory is certain.
Professor Farid, I'd like promise last thing. Please say to us, how can we reach out to you, the group you are part of, Africa for Palestine website.
Africa for Palestine. We are on Facebook and on Twitter, on TikTok, on everywhere, and That's Africa, and then for Africa, for Palestine. Okay.
Yes, summing the solidarity movement, internationalizing and making anchoring better even the movement. Thank you very much, Farid.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum.
Pleasure.
Thank
Okay.
you.